taken from their families.
We are sorry.
It's still happening.
Reconciliation to me means not saying sorry twice.
Underfunding allegations resisted.
I can't understand it unless I go to places of questioning the very morality of the people in government.
Is there a better way?
It's a ridiculous plan to place children in care and traumatize them for a long period of time when they don't need to be there.
Cindy Blackstock says there are more First Nation children in care right now than at the height of the residential school system. That's a statement that's intended to shock us, and it does. But then she goes even further. A human rights complaint filed by the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada against the Department of Indian Affairs in 2007 alleges that when on-reserve child and family services get less funding than provincial programs, it's discrimination, a human rights violation. If the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal agrees, it will be a great embarrassment for the Government of Canada. So far, that complaint is moving very slowly at the tribunal. APTN's Rob Smith investigates.
So when we're looking at these families at a community level, we need to think, do we have something better to offer them by removing their kids and putting them in foster care? And in the vast majority of cases, we don't.
The Government of Canada now
recognizes
that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes.
In Canada today, 27,000 Aboriginal children are in the care of the government. That number represents an estimated 30 to 40% of the total number of kids in care, despite the fact that Aboriginal people make up only 4% of Canada's population.
I didn't want to be, I didn't want to socialize with anybody, I just wanted to stay home. Because people would ask me where my kids were.
Kate McPherson had her newborn taken from her because she had a drug problem. With the support of her community, she was able to get her child returned.
I said, "You want to test me?" I said, "We'll do a test right now." I said, "I'm not going back to that lifestyle. I want my family back."
Studies have shown that children that grow up in foster care are less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to run afoul of the law, more likely to suffer mental health issues. Those tracking the children say similarities to residential school survivors are striking. They suffer the same cultural dislocation, the same negative multi-generational effects, such as poor parenting skills. Some estimates have 3 times the amount of kids in foster care today than there were at the height of residential schools.
We are sorry.
Reconciliation to me means not saying sorry twice.
We now recognize that in separating children from their families,
on the day that Canadian Prime Minister made this historic apology to First Nations people for pains they suffered as children at residential schools,
we undermine the ability of many to adequately parent their own children.
Cindy Blackstock was listening, skeptical of what she was hearing.
The Government of Canada now
and I was on the lawns of Parliament
that it was wrong
when the Prime Minister was apologizing. And as I sat there, I was also in the midst of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on First Nations child welfare.
And we apologize for having done this.
Tired of broken promises, tired of studies, and tired of inaction, Cindy Blackstock is taking on Canada, arguing that its policies regarding child welfare on reserve is racist. Canada fires back saying what Cindy Blackstock is complaining about is not their fault. So it's been left up to a highly unique and highly controversial Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to deal with the whole mess.
I found it really hard to understand why the government would apologize for a policy that was removing children from their families, and then at the same time in this generation fighting for the right to allow that same process to happen in child welfare.
Blackstock wants a complete overhaul of the system and insists the reforms needed to reverse this crisis are ready to be implemented if only the federal government pays its share. The first thing needed, she says, is the same funding for child welfare on reserve as off reserve. She says kids on reserve receive 22% less money. Many of the preventative services seen in provincial child welfare systems are not seen in the Indian Affairs run system. Blackstock argues that's a human rights abuse, contributing to more and more kids being placed in foster care.
It is about racism.
In 2007, with the support of the Assembly of First Nations, Blackstock laid a human rights complaint against the federal government.
Part of it is just trying to flood us with documents.
It appears this case has made Blackstock unpopular on the Hill. She is the director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, a non-profit organization based in Ottawa. Funding from the federal government was soon cut after she filed the complaint. Staff had to be laid off. And then there's this letter from the Office of the Minister of Indian Affairs regarding an incident there December 9th, 2009. It was written after Blackstock was escorted out of the office and guarded by security. It was her understanding that she was considered a security breach. In the letter, the minister's chief of staff writes, "You were not originally listed as one of the participants. We felt that meeting with you at that time was not appropriate." The case has dragged on for 4 years now, fraught with delays. The government tried to have the case thrown out. It argued in federal court that they only provide the funding. Child welfare is a provincial jurisdiction, and any human rights issues should be directed to the service providers.
They're fighting this on legal technicalities. Where are the kids in any of Canada's arguments?
The judge disagreed and ruled the tribunal should have a look at it.
Order, please. All rise.
Proceedings finally got underway in September 2009, but the hearing was short-lived. More delays followed. After hearing the case for 1 day, the original chair, Grant Sinclair, retired in November. His successor could have extended Sinclair's term, but didn't. The last time Blackstock was here, she says Sinclair was prepared to hear the case through to its conclusion. So it came as a shock to her when Sinclair was replaced by a relative newcomer, Sharice Shatalia.
All of a sudden, this new person appears on the scene. And just days before we were to begin the hearing on the merits, she vacates all our hearing dates. And she says the reason she's doing it is so we can expedite the rule.
The First Nations agency servicemen are unable to meet their mandated responsibilities.
That was more than a year ago. Ottawa insiders have suggested that Sinclair's term was not extended so he could be replaced by a more cooperative chair for the government. We wanted to put that question to Chair Sharice Shatalia, but our request for an interview went unanswered.
Hello, Mr.
Grant Sinclair, however, did talk with us, but he did not want to be recorded. Sinclair says his term was always going to be up in November of 2009. He has no issue walking away and beginning his retirement because he says the case never really got off the ground. He recalls a couple of hours of opening statements and then a request for adjournment from the Caring Society lawyer who was leading the case. However, he does acknowledge that an argument could have been made that he did indeed start the hearings and should be extended until the completion of the case. But nobody made that argument. Questions arose in Ottawa on the growing number of appointed positions in various tribunals and commissions that have not been renewed. Prominent names include Paul Kennedy, chair for the public complaints against the RCMP, and Pete Tinsley, chair of the Military Police Complaints Commission. This article from Capital News Online quoted a law professor at the University of Ottawa. There seems to be a growing trend with this government. If you do not like what they are doing, just dump them. The article also notes a full-scale change of employees at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. When Chair Shatalia adjourned the case last year, she did so to review the government's motion to dismiss. It's the same motion already rejected by a federal judge and the original chair of the tribunal, Grant Sinclair.
So in this case, the Attorney General has both the power to appoint the tribunal chairs and tribunal members, and also the power, he's also a defendant in the case. I can only hope that that independence is there.
Of course, what's at the heart of this case is the care, and in some cases, the survival of vulnerable children. Why are First Nations kids being apprehended in the first place? The Canadian Incident Study on Reported Child Abuse and Neglect shows it's not physical or sexual abuse, it's neglect.
First Nations kids are not more likely to be abused than non-Aboriginal kids. In fact, they're less likely to experience sexual abuse. So that's not what's driving this overrepresentation. It's factors like poverty, poor housing, and substance misuse. Interestingly, for on reserve, the Minister of Indian Affairs holds all the levers to be able to change all three factors, and yet has chosen not to do so.
Biggest failure in child welfare is when a child dies.
4 years after her tragic death, the body of a First Nation girl is...
The Port Alberni toddler was beaten to death.
These tragic events create big headlines and always set off a political firestorm.
And it sits squarely with the Premier of this province.
A process that's been on some stormy seas.
In 2006, Ted Hughes reviewed BC's child welfare system. He slammed the province for budget cuts to programs that he said contributed to the death of Sherry Charlie. Provincial opposition had a field day.
This is the #1 scandal in our province.
And the province was contrite.
We acknowledge Mr. Hughes' comments.
19-month-old Sherry Charlie was beaten to death by her uncle, Ryan George, in 2002. George was sentenced to 10 years in jail.
10 years is never enough. My daughter is gone.
Charlie had been taken by social workers at USMA, a First Nations child service, because the parents had been drinking, something the father denied.
There was just not enough significant grounds for this to happen.
An USMA employee just happened to be Charlie's aunt. She took custody of the child even though her boyfriend, George, just 9 months earlier, was charged with spousal assault. The province put $400 million back into the ministry.
But not a dime of that would go on reserve.
Blackstock warns focusing only on these extreme and rare cases involving a death of a child is unhelpful.
What I don't think there's evidence to support is using those cases to drive entire child welfare policy.
Deaths are rare, and as we will see, many First Nations across this country are trying their best to focus on prevention.
An internal review by the Department of Indian Affairs found on-reserve child and family services programs had one major flaw. By not funding preventative programs, the only option left was to take the children into foster care.